Check that you have all your patterns: your front top, back top, bottom sleeve, sleeve cuff, back tie, and tie bow, your front skirt and your back skirt. Sew up the darts on your front skirt. On the front skirt, fold in the sides by 1 cm and iron well, then top stitch with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. For the back skirt, measure 80% of your back waist and cut the appropriate length of elastic band. We're going to sew the elastic band to the top of the back skirt so that it remains stretchy after sewing. Continue watching for a sewing demo. Step 1. Change the stitch length on your sewing machine to a zigzag stitch, and then pin the start, end and middle of the elastic band to the top of the skirt. This helps you to gauge how much you have to pull the elastic in order to match up the lengths. So start sewing right at the edge, just a couple of stitches first before you pull. Once I feel that it's secure, I'm going to start to pull the elastic band as I sew, so that the length of the elastic stretches out to match out the length of the skirt. One hand at the back of the machine is helpful so that the fabric doesn't bounce back towards myself. You notice I'm positioning the elastic band approximately 0.5 cm from the edge of the fabric. Repeat this until you've reached the end of the fabric. Next, fold over the fabric while stretching it. Keep it flat and stretched while sewing it down. You're folding down approximately 1 cm. So again, at the start, I'm not going to pull. I'm just going to secure the end first. Here I am sewing with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. Sew the front skirt to the back skirt at the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. For the hem of the skirt, fold it up by 3 cm and iron well. Then sew it down with a 2 cm seam allowance from the folded edge. For the back tie, we're going to baste a ribbon on the shorter edge with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. place the other set of back tie together. Then sew the 3 sides together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Before we turn it inside out, trim away the extra seam allowance to reduce the bulk. Then turn it inside out and iron well. Top stitch along those 3 sides with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Sew 1 set of front top and back top panels together at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. Sew up the corresponding front and back top mirror image at the shoulder with the 1 cm seam allowance. Match up the main fabric and the lining together. Sew along this edge with a 1 cm seam allowance. Do not sew the armhole or the side seam. Be mindful to leave an opening where the notches are. Grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk. Turn it inside out. Now, to prevent the lining from being seen when it's worn, we're going to sew an understitch on the lining panel. Spread open the fabric like so. Pushing all the seam allowances towards the lining, you're going to understitch near the seam on the lining panel. The distance to aim for would be less than 0.5. Due to the shape, you'll only be able to understitch from here to here and here to here. Repeat for the other side, so again the front and the back together, and sew at the shoulder with a 1 cm seam allowance. For this side, however, we're going to add some elastic loops before we continue on. So grab a piece of stretchy elastic band. First, make a marking of the sewing line. So that will be 1 cm from the short edge and 1 cm from both ends. Place your loops in between the sewing line. You can either use 2 or just 1. Let me show you how to sew it down. First, we're going to sew 1 elastic band down first. So just sew exactly on the sewing line. Then make a loop that is suitable for your button. And then sew again on that vertical line on both elastic bands this time. Repeat this if you'd like to do another elastic loop. On the front skirt, Cut a notch so that it goes all the way to the sewing line. So your notch should be 1 centimeter long. Fold down the middle section and iron well. You should be folding down 1 centimeter seam allowance. I've already attached one side to show you how it'll look like. Before we start sewing, you should find a very acute right angle where the folded edge is. Slot the part that is sticking out of the skirt into that opening on the front top. Sandwich it in between, and you're going to sew 1 centimeter seam allowance to seal up the fabric. If you feel like the hole is too small for that fabric of skirt, go ahead and unpick a little bit to enlarge the opening. Fold down the middle section of the skirt, and you're going to sew it down with a 0.8 cm seam allowance from edge to edge. To prevent the lining from being shown when being worn, sew an understitch on the lining panel. So open up the front panel like so and sew onto the lining. Flip open the front and back top. Overlock along the armhole and the side seams. On your back top panel, locate the notch. We're going to baste the back tie just below the notch with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Flip the back top down and sew the front and back top panels together at the side seam, not the armhole but the side seam, with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. The extra fabric here at the front top panel, tuck it in to create a very soft diagonal line towards the skirt. Iron well and sew down, continuing from the stitch of the back tie so that it looks cohesive, and sew down all the way with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. Get one set of bottom sleeve panels. Sew both sides together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitch at the bottom. Make sure stitch length is 5.0 and do not backstitch. Fold the sleeve cuff into half and sew them together with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Then spread open the seam allowances and fold it into half lengthwise and iron well. Before we attach the bottom sleeve to the sleeve cuff, fold the sleeve cuff at the seam allowance and mark the opposite end. So we have successfully divided the sleeve cuff into half. For the bottom sleeve, there is a side that is shorter and it's called the side seam, and the longer side is called the shoulder seam. Match up the shoulder seam, which is the longer side, to the marking that we made earlier, the halfway marking, and then match up the side seam of the cuff to the side seam of the bottom sleeve. Gently pull the gathering stitch so that the circumference matches the size of the sleeve cuff. I've reduced the circumference of the bottom sleeve to match the size of the sleeve cuff. Once again, remember to match the longer side shoulder seam to the halfway marking and the side seam to the side seam of the sleeve cuff. Flip over so that the raw edges are all facing the seam direction. So the raw edge of the bottom sleeve and the raw edges of the sleeve cuff. Sew them together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Once you're done, overlock along the same edge. Sew the bottom sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance, making sure the shoulder seam is facing the top and the side seam is facing the bottom. To prepare the tie rope, fold it into half lengthwise. Iron and sew in an L shape with a 1 cm seam allowance. Trim away half of the seam allowance so that's easier to turn it inside out. Once you're done, use a loop turner or any other tool you have to turn this tie rope inside out, and then iron well. You have the option to use the tie rope and slot it in, like this example here. If not, you can also choose to omit that and use an elastic band instead. If you want to use an elastic band, overlap the center front gently. So you can try this dress on and then decide how much you want to overlap and sew it down. And then use an appropriate length size of elastic. Use a zigzag stitch and sew it along the bust line. Now, if you would like to use the tie rope option, sew a 1.5 cm top stitch along the bust line. Then, on the inside, on the lining only, do not tear through your main fabric. Okay, only on the lining. Use a seam ripper and gently rip open a hole. So I'm not going beyond that 1.5 centimeter top stitch that I did earlier. Take your tie rope, fold it into half so it's slightly narrower and easier to navigate through the tunnel. I'm using a safety pin here. And I'm going to tunnel it from one end all the way to the other. Pull the tie rope, not entirely so, if not it would just come out of the tunnel, leaving a tail of about 1 centimeter. Turn to the right side of the fabric and top stitch along the existing stitch so you can back stitch up and down to secure it. Repeat for the other side. Hand sew a couple of buttons depending on how many loops you made. And there you have it, your dress is completed.